Bear Brothers, the Vireon Saga. Part 3, The First Wedge, a blind eye and a deaf ear. Orcs replenish their numbers quickly, according to their noxious ways. They are also, as a group, exceedingly more clever than anyone alone. Before long, they had firmly established themselves in the Blackleg Mountains, as they were known. Sprouting like the fungi they spawn from, huts and fortifications spread through the narrow valleys, while the caves below became infested with snotlings and Gretchen. Any seam or hole, that outlet from the Blacklegs, spewed forth orc raiders regularly, and no water that sprang from the range was drinkable. The tribes and settlers who dwelt near the foothills soon disappeared or relocated, and so the orc raids grew bolder and reached farther. The most aggressive of these raiding clans, known as the Gloomskulls, began to range far from the caves of the Blacklegs. They were the first to attack an imperial settlement. They typically bedecked themselves in black painted armor and would smear a concoction of black Vireon earth and unknown filth over their skin like war paint. Thus disguised, they learned to fall upon human settlements in the night for maximum carnage. This was not so much a precaution as a guarantee of more gutting and less chasing. One such Gloomskulls raid became the first hammer strike to a wedge that would soon divide the colony asunder and seal the fate of Vireo. Even as orc raids grew bolder, the imperial garrison grew more withdrawn. When the first reconnaissance of the northern campaign revealed the orc horde to be relatively small, the colonel who commanded the Vireon Guard began to loudly make plans to meet the orcs forthwith. This did not happen. As the horde's advance brought it ever closer, the colonel, his name now lost to history, would claim he would bring the might of his forces upon their heads if they dared to encroach further. While the Vireon tribesmen died slowing and then halting the orc army, he would declare them lucky the savages had walloped them before he had the chance. For a time, his bluster was tolerated by the colonial settlers. After all, the orcs had not as yet managed to attack any Imperials, and the natives seemed to be dealing with them effectively enough. But then the Gloomskulls burned Oliwich. The town had been quite close to the capital, and most of its residents were documented Imperial citizens. As if the colonel had been ignoring their demands all along, the colonists were immediately enraged. The people of Jegan Station began to gather in mobs, branding the guardsman shirkers, the colonel a coward, and charging him to drive the orcs back into their caves immediately. He responded by securing the guard compound and cutting off all communication. This tactic had the predictable result. The people began to riot. While the colonel was content to hide in his apartments, his troops, who had begun to get nervous about the mobs without the compound, took the insults more personally. Cradled in a tradition of civil abuse and eager to prove their martial dominance, the guardsmen did what came naturally and decided to make an example of local Vireon natives and half-breeds. A dozen or so were collected and put against the wall as rabble-rousers. The ripples this action caused were unanticipated and far-reaching. The imperial citizens of Jegans who'd been rioting were, if not mollified, certainly quieted. But Vireons and mixed bloods throughout the territory, who had no part in the riots, began to stir. The planetary governor, not being a stupid man, knew these rumblings would end in more than easily quelled riots. It was his prerogative to call on imperial assistance from beyond the Vireon system if he deemed it prudent. However, both the communications array and the planet's only sanctioned psyker were housed in the presently locked down guard compound. Knowing he could not rely on his military to deal with the orc threat or civil unrest, and bereft of options, he ordered the colonel to contact extra-planetary Imperial forces by any means possible. The request to be relayed included a recommendation that all Vireons without Imperial documentation should be eliminated in the name of civil harmony. Now, the colonel was a braggart and a coward, but he was not wholly without quality. Though he had little hope that aid of any kind would be forthcoming from the Imperial Navy or anyone else, he did not approve of such drastic measures and refused to relay the orders for fear they would be answered. Instead, he he sent a request only for assistance against the orcs. Privately, he likely feared anything else might lead to uncomfortable questions being asked. The contents of the original message got out among the population, however, though the colonel's refusal to convey them did not. It was the death knell to governmental authority and bellows for the flames of revolution. More orc attacks on imperial settlements raised rebel cries to a fever pitch. Both frightened and emboldened by fringe-class momentum, desperate imperial colonists recollected their original anger, and soon the whole populace was in open revolt. But there was little they could do. The governor and any other loyal administrative staff had found asylum within the guard compound, and imperial guard fortifications, by their very nature, are largely unassailable. Any rebel bold enough to attempt ingress was promptly shot down, and so, caught between the orcs and imperial walls, there was naught for the seething populace to do but wait. A sort of frantic siege developed outside the compound, but Vireo did not have the time for attrition or the patience for diplomacy. In the end, it was not much of a siege, but it did have pivotal consequences. A particularly magnetic radical emerged as a leader among the disenfranchised. He was called Ronan and was reportedly of mixed heritage, and so could be a champion of everyone and no one. He did not use this to his advantage, however, because his views were extreme and heretical, and so he alienated the more pious and traditional imperial citizens. A fracture appeared in the ranks of the malcontent. While Ronan stirred the passion of some, he frightened and disaffected others. The Gloomskulls and other orc tribes began to establish permanent encampments within raiding distance. The people were divided about what to do. Two camps emerged. Colonists who at first had joined in the cries for blood now found themselves defending the administration and military. They reasoned the civil upheaval had made it impossible for the administration to operate or protect them. They became ashamed they had not been loyal to the government, and that shame evolved into fierce resolve. They were convinced their only salvation was to persuade the guard they were now safe to come out and fight off the orcs. Meekly, they entreated the colonel to spare them or provide them weapons with which to defend themselves. If they'd have had the chance, they would have been disappointed, as the governor had relieved the remorseful colonel of his duties and taken command. He had no plans to do anything but fortify the bunker and wait for the Imperial Navy to arrive. But the Loyalists did not have the chance to realize the futility of their petitions. Ronan and his followers believed if they wanted salvation, they'd have to buy it themselves. They knew the guard would not, and likely could not, protect the population from the orcs. They had not forgotten the governor's extermination recommendation, and so Ronan had the total support of every undocumented Vireon. The rebels were extremely anxious, believing each hour increased the likelihood that the governor's deadly request would be heard. After sending treaty proposals to all nearby Tuatha chiefs, Ronan had all in place and set in motion a plan to finally get past the garrison's impassable walls. How this was accomplished is unknown, but Ronan and his rebel followers did get into the compound. The Loyalists had gone back to their homes in a show of submission and were unaware of Ronan's plans. The walls were breached, the colonel hid in a mess hall refrigeration unit, the governor was killed, the psyker was wounded and left for dead, several armories were emptied, and the communications array was sabotaged beyond repair. Dozens of troops and rebels were killed and dozens more wounded. The attack was a resounding success. With the governor out of the way, the colonel retook command of his Vireon guard. After securing the garrison, it became clear that Ronan and his followers had entirely left the capital. The colonel then secured the administrative complex and appointed himself de facto planetary governor. Though his name is forgotten, never let it be said that this lowly colonel was easily broken. He immediately put out several declarations claiming to have expelled Ronan and his followers from the city, and, somehow simultaneously, commissioned them to form a citizens' militia to deal with the orcs. Showing command competence, absent since the orcs arrived, he put the citizens to work on Jegan's perimeter, reinforcing the wall and increasing fortifications. he claimed neither rebel nor orc would ever crack the defenses. Privately, he must have had his doubts, because his next step was to order a decorated delegation of troops and the highest-ranking diplomat to board the unit's dedicated transport ship and seek the Imperial Navy, or anyone else who could help post-haste. The orcs were multiplying quickly and clearly working up to something more devastating than a raid. The planetary forces were simply not adequate to deal with them, and without any other means of communication, this was his only recourse. But it was not the orcs on the surface that would trouble him that day. As Vireo's last great hope embarked on its desperate voyage, the slumbering orc fleet, till now so silent and still, woke up and shot the transport out of the sky before it broke the mesosphere. Not one to give in to discouragement, the Colonel-Governor straightway called for volunteers from his 3rd platoon to find the most functional interstellar vessel moored at Jegan Station and board it. This was a desperate move and very unlikely to succeed. There were no vessels left truly capable of the necessary distances required, let alone speedy enough to be effective. Without a navigator, they would be lucky not to plunge straight into the warp storm. It would take great luck to encounter another ship in the sparsely traveled shipping lanes convenient to the system. There was no astro path, so communications would be extremely short range. They were to take the ailing Psyker along in hopes that he would be of some assistance in that capacity, assuming he did not die of his wounds first. The hope was that a smaller vessel, prepared this time, would be able to escape the planet unnoticed. As the humble merchant cargo vessel disappeared into the Vireon night sky, the Colonel-Governor's attention was diverted. A combined war party of Gloomskulls and other clans was approaching from the north. They had not come on a scouting mission. Elsewhere, within a circle of monolithic standing stones deep within the Vireon forest, Ronan and his lieutenants sat down amidst a circle of 17 Tuatha chiefs to make plans for war. In Ronan's heart, he knew that one day the Imperium would simply destroy his beloved home and all that lived upon it. He would fight the orcs, and if need be, die fighting them. But it was the Imperium and its navy that kept him awake at night. If he had to, he would kill every documented Imperial citizen to prevent that from happening. He would prevent it, if not him, then those who followed him. This planet was never meant to be colonized. While civil war and orc plundering ravaged Vireo, a psychic SOS echoed weakly across the void. It was born in the fevered mind of a dying Psyker and received by a rune master of the mighty space wolves.